It's very easy to win a game like this where you have a passed pawn and the opponent's king is not lying in the square of this passed pawn. Now, if you don't know the rule of the square, then I've already made a video on it, so please check it out, the link of which is given in the I button above as well as in the description box below. So in this case, white can easily win without the help of his king because the opponent's king was not in the square of the passed pawn. But what about this situation? Here, the defending king is already lying inside the square of the passed pawn. So if this pawn goes ahead and tries to promote, then he can be easily stopped by the defending king, and now it's a draw. So how should white win this game? Therefore, in such a case, it becomes very important to learn the concept of key squares when you are playing a king and a pawn versus king endgames. So here in such a scenario, you will have to take help of your king. So just imagine this scenario. Just like a father always leads his child across the road and he never pushes his child ahead of him, in a similar way, here if you want to win this king and pawn ending game, then imagine that white king is the father and this pawn is a son. Similarly, this king, which is the father, will have to help his pawn, his son, to walk up the road and get on the queening square. So that is why the winning move over here is king to b5, because in that way you are taking a direct opposition. The black king doesn't have any of these squares to go. So if he moves here, then you will push your king one more time ahead. Again taking direct opposition and blocking all the way to get near to this pawn or to this queening square. If king moves forward, then you will again take opposition one more time. And now it doesn't matter what black plays here because now you can simply queen the pawn. So I know this was easy. But how will you calculate the best moves, the winning moves in all of these different situations that are seen on the board? How can white win all of these games? Because the position of king and the pawn are changing in every situation. So that is why we have a technique to help ease our calculations. And that is knowing the key squares for each pawn. Because if you as an attacking king are able to occupy one of those key squares, then you can easily win the game. And if your opponent is successful in occupying one of those key squares, then he will be successfully able to draw the game. So what are the key squares in this situation? So let's start studying first about the rook pawn. So a rook pawn is a pawn which is either on the A file or on the H file. And in case of rook pawns, it can be very tricky because their chances of getting promoted are very less because most of the times the game leads to a draw. So if you have a rook pawn in the game, then the key squares for this pawn would be these 7 squares. All of these 7 squares marked with the red color are the key squares for this pawn. Okay. Now that means that if this defending king is able to get into any one of these squares, then with correct play, the defending king will be able to draw this game. And the key squares for the attacking king in the case of a rook pawn are these 2 squares, the ones marked with the green color. So if the attacking king is able to occupy any one of these squares, then he can easily win the game. So for the defending king, it would be a total of these 7 squares, and for the attacking king, it will be only these 2 squares. Now why only these 2 squares? So the logic is very simple. Since a pawn is going to promote on this square, you want to keep the defending king away from this square, and the only way to do is you're getting your king to either this square or this square. So that is why the key squares for the attacking king would be these 2. And for the defending king, it would be a total of these 7 squares. Now an easy way to remember these squares is just form a flag like this, as you can see, or it forms a letter F, or if you are playing with an H pawn, then just draw a reversed F and you would know the key squares for your rook pawn. So that's a simple way to remember it. So since it was white's turn, white knows that he needs to get to one of these 2 squares in order to facilitate safe promotion of his pawn. So that is why when it was white's turn, white first moved his king over here. And when the opponent king moved up, white moved up another square. And when black played king to d7, white played king to b7, because white in this case was making sure that his king gets to one of these two squares, as well as making sure at the same time that the opponent king is not able to get into any one of these 7 squares. As you can see, the opponent king is not inside these squares, so that is why white was safely able to promote his pawn. Now let's go back. Now in the same situation, if it was black's turn to move, then what do you think the result of the game would have been? Well, it would have been a draw, because all black needs to do is get into one of these 7 squares. So black would have played king to c6, and now the king cannot move here. So if king comes over here, the black king would have moved here, and now after this it's very hard for white to make a progress. If white pushes the pawn, then king moves over here, and now after this it's a draw, because if the white king moves over here, then black can easily attack this pawn, and now white cannot protect, so anyway it's a draw. And if white moves back, then black can move forward, and this is just endless, and the game would end up in a draw by the threefold repetition rule. Obviously, if the players keep repeating this position, because in any case there is no way for white to make progress over here. However, there is an exception that I want to show you. If you see, white has a rook pawn, okay, and black's king has already entered in one of the key squares of the rook pawn, so it looks like that black will be able to draw. But if it was black's move over here, then black could have easily drawn the position, because he would have played king to b8, and now after check he would have simply gotten into the corner, and now king a6 simply leads to stalemate, and any other king move would simply lose this pawn, and the game would get drawn due to insufficient material. So let's go back. So if it was black's move, then black would have been able to draw, but the catch here is that it is white's turn to play, and because it is white's turn, white can now play a7, taking control of this key square and stopping the black king from getting near to this pass pawn or to the corner of the board. Now the defending king does not have access to all of these squares, so he has to move either on one of these two squares, and now the pawn simply queens. So let's go back. So do remember this exceptional situation, that even if the defending king has gotten into the key square, it depends on whose turn it is to move. So if it was white's turn over here to move, then white could have easily won the game. But if it was black's turn to move, then black would have successfully drawn the game. Now let's look at two amazing case studies to understand the concept of key squares for a rook pawn. So here is one of the famous games played in the year 1968 between Oscar Panno, who was Argentine Grandmaster, and Miguel Najdorf, who was a Polish Argentinian Grandmaster. So as you can see, white has an extra pawn over here, and Najdorf, who was playing with the black pieces, he didn't calculate well, and he thought that maybe if he is able to exchange these rooks and then get rid of all of these pawns, then he will be easily able to draw this game somehow. But he didn't do his calculations well, and his plan actually backfired him. So he starts the exchange program with first king to b5, attacking both the pawn as well as the rook. So the rook moves backward, and now he moves his other pawn forward, and king comes on the g4 square to attack this pawn, and now rook takes pawn, and rook takes rook, king takes rook, king takes pawn, and now here we have reached a situation of a king and pawn versus king endgame. So Oscar here has the h pawn, that is the rook pawn. So all Oscar needs to do is get into the key squares of this pawn. So since Oscar is on the attacking side, he needs to make sure that his king gets into one of these two squares. And since Najdorf wants to get a draw, he has to make sure that his king gets into one of these 7 squares. These are the 7 key squares for the defending king. So Najdorf here starts with king to b7, moving towards the king side of the board. Oscar plays king to g4, and now king to c7, king to g5, and now here Najdorf realized that he's too far from these key squares of the rook pawn, and his king cannot reach on time, and Oscar's king would immediately take control of this square, and therefore there is no way to stop this rook pawn. So that is why Najdorf at this point of time resigned in the game. Let's look at another case study. This game was played in the year 1959 between Hungarian Grandmaster Gedeon Barcza and 11th world champion and American Grandmaster Bobby Fischer. So Bobby was playing with the black pieces, and after both the players reached this position in the game, they agreed to a draw. Now, why did they agree to a draw? Because it was white's turn in the game, and all white needs to do is get into one of these 7 squares in order to stop the promotion of this pawn. So the game could have continued with king to d2, black would have played king to b3, and now white would have played king to c1. See how already white is already inside in one of the 7 squares for this passed pawn. If black plays king to a2, then white can play king to c2, taking the opposition. And now if black plays a4, then white plays king to c1, a3, king to c2, and now king to a1 is forced, and white can now play king to b3, and after a2 and king to c2, notice how white king is constantly trying to be in one of these 7 squares, and after this last king to c2 move, it's a stalemate. So white was successfully able to draw this position. So that is why in the actual game, when both the players reached this position, they agreed for a draw. Do like this video and subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed learning something new today. And now let's move on to other type of pawns. Now you already know how to win or draw if you have a rook pawn. But what about the other pawns? The pawns that are not the rook pawns. How can you win the game? What are the key squares for these pawns? So if the pawns hasn't crossed the midpoint of the board, then there are 3 key squares 2 ranks ahead of them. So in this case, this pawn hasn't crossed the midpoint. So there are 3 key squares for this pawn. And those squares are 1, 2 and 3. These 3 are the key squares for this pawn if you want this pawn to queen on the board. So that means if the defending king is able to get into any one of these squares, then you will not be able to promote up this pawn. He will force a draw. And if your attacking king is able to get into any one of these squares, then you can easily promote this pawn. Okay. Now similar is the case for this pawn. This pawn also has not crossed the midpoint of this board. So therefore his key squares would be these 3 ones. Similarly, the key squares for this pawn which has not crossed the midpoint of the board will be these 3 squares. So in short, if your pawn hasn't crossed the midpoint of the board, then there would be 3 squares 2 ranks ahead, 1 and 2. 2 ranks ahead, these will be the 3 squares. Alright? And these squares would be the same for the defending king as well as the attacking king. Now let's consider this example. Now since this pawn hasn't crossed the midpoint, we know that the key squares for this pawn are these 3 squares. So before trying to push this pawn, if white wants to really win this game, then white should aim to get his king in one of these 3 squares. So white should play king to g2. Now the opponent king also tries to get into these key squares. Now you play here and now this, and now see, your king has already entered one of the key squares for this pawn. So now you can easily win the game. So let's say now black plays here king to e6. Then you can play king to d4, making sure your king is in the center of all of these 3 squares. If black plays king to f5, then now you can play d3. Black might play king to e6, and now since the pawn has moved up by 1 square, okay, but it hasn't passed the midpoint, the key squares for this pawn are now these 3 squares. So now you will simply get your king to one of these 3 squares. So the obvious square is this king to c5, and now even if black gets his king over here, you can simply check the black king. He has to move, and now since the pawn's position has changed and now the new key squares are these 3, so you want to make sure that the opponent king leaves this key squares. So you will play king to c6, giving direct opposition to this king. The king is forced to leave, and now you can simply push the pawn, or you can also play king to c7, taking a direct opposition one more time. Both of these moves are completely winning. So let's play d5, making sure we are also taking this square. And now since the pawn has crossed the midpoint of the board, now the key squares for this pawn changes. So we will come back to this example again. I'll just leave it here right now. And let's first look at what are the key squares if the pawns have crossed the midpoint of the board. So if they have crossed the midpoint of the board, then there would be 6 key squares for these pawns. So for this pawn, the key squares would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All of these 6 squares on the 2 ranks in front of him would be the important ones. And for this pawn, the key squares would be these ones. All the squares are on the 2 ranks in front of this pawn. Alright? And if the pawn has reached the 7th rank, then the key squares would be the adjoining squares on the same rank as well as on the rank ahead of him. So these 5 squares would be the key squares for this pawn on the 7th rank. Now since you have understood the key squares for the pawns which have passed the midpoint, let's now come back to this example and try to win this game. Now since the pawn is on the 5th rank, since it has already crossed the midpoint of the board, therefore the key squares would be 6 squares. All of these 6 squares on the 2 ranks in front of him would be the important ones. Now since you pushed your pawn up and you have already taken all of these squares from the black king, he is now forced to leave this key square zone of the pawn. So let's say he moves to the d8 square, and now here is an important moment. You can't afford to play d6. Don't make this mistake, because if you do, then the key squares for this pawn would be these 6 squares, and the opponent king will be able to stay. And doesn't matter in that case if the opponent king moves this side or that side, he will be able to stay in one of the key squares. That is why d6 will draw the game. So before pushing the pawn forward, what should you do? You should take the opposition from the opponent king. So you would play king to d6. Now the black king doesn't have any of these squares. So he is forced to either go on this side or either to this side. Let's say he moves to the c8 square. So now you will simply play king to e7, king moves over here, and now you can simply check, king moves over here, you can simply check, and now there is no stopping of this pawn. So let me revise everything for you quickly. So if you have a rook pawn, then the key squares for the defending king would be 7 squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And for the attacking king, the key squares would be these 2 squares. Alright? And if you have a non-rook pawn, a pawn which is not a rook pawn, then in that case you have to see the position of the pawns. If the pawns have not crossed the midpoints of the board, then their key squares would be 3 squares just 2 ranks ahead of them. So in this case, the key square for this c pawn would be these 3. The key square for this e pawn would be these 3 squares, and the key squares for this g pawn would be these 3 squares. Alright, so 3 squares 2 ranks ahead. Okay, so if the pawns have already crossed the midpoint of the board, then their key squares would be 6 squares on the 2 ranks ahead of them. So in case of this d pawn, the key squares would be these 6 squares. And in the case of this f pawn, the key squares would be these 6 squares. Alright, and if the pawn has reached on the 7th rank, then all the adjoining squares on the same rank as well as the rank ahead of him will be the key squares. Now before I teach you another interesting fact in this category, I want you to like this video. It really motivates me to make such amazing content for you. And now let's look at this exception case. And we call this case as the knight pawn exception, or we can also call it the b pawn or the g pawn trap. Now since the knight pawns are always either on the b file or on the g file, we will call this exception as the b pawn or the g pawn trap. Now what is the trap here? So just look at this position. If it was white's turn to move, then white could have easily won this game by pushing this pawn ahead and checking the black king. King moves and now the pawn promotes, right? It's such an easy win. But if it is black's turn, then this is a stalemate. So as you can see, the key squares for this pawn are these 6 squares, right? And white as well as the black king have already entered into one of these squares. But since it was black's turn to move, he did not have any legal move, and that is why the game got stalemated. So you do want to remember this position so as to make sure that you do not end up stalemating your winning position by allowing the black king to enter into the corner of the board and reaching to this situation where it is black's turn to play. Now let's look at an amazing case study to understand the situation of a knight pawn better. So this game was played in the year 1946 between British chess player Harry Golombek and Spanish chess player and chess author Arturo Salamanca. So here it was white's turn, and white was not aware of this B pawn trap or the G pawn trap that I just showed you. So he went ahead with king to f6, and here his opponent played king to h7, and now he played king to f7 taking direct opposition from the king, and now king moves to h8, and here Harry realized that he cannot play g6 because that would simply stalemate the game and he would simply fall into this G pawn trap. So realizing this, he again played king to g6, opponent played king to g8. Now we have again come to the same situation on the board, but this time instead of moving his king to the f6, he now moved his king to the h6 square. The opponent got his king to the corner of the board, and now Harry played g6. The king moved to g8 and now g7, and now there is no stopping of the promotion of this pawn. King moved to f7, king h7, and black obviously resigned here. So let's go back. So you see, since this game was played in 1946, players were not aware of this knight pawn exception rule. So that is why white had to waste his time in playing such moves, and then ultimately realizing that king f6 is not working because it will simply allow black to stalemate the game. So then again he had to correct his move. He played king to h6, and now there was no stopping of this pawn. I'm sure you must have thoroughly understood the concept of this video, and if you have, then here is the challenging puzzle for you. So here white has a passed pawn on the c file, and the pawn hasn't crossed the midpoint of the board, and it is white's turn to play. So what should white play here? Should he play king to d2 or should he play king to c2? One of these moves wins the game for white and the other one draws the game. So calculate well and do let me know your answers in the comments box, and I'll see you in the next video.